The resurrection of Christ. Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then Christianity, as a belief system and as a way of life, is in vain. On the other hand, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then that validates his message and biblical belief or Christianity as a whole. So we want to look at this idea of the resurrection rather closely. In his book on miracles, C.S. Lewis is talking about the view that miracle claims in general are a kind of deus ex machina, in quite a literal sense. So some people, for that reason, find them implausible. But he goes on to explain the resurrection was the whole point of history in the first place, so we ought to be surprised if it didn't happen, if it did not happen, at least on Christian assumptions. We would expect something like the resurrection to make sense of history. At any rate, the resurrection is extremely important, and we now turn our attention to it. Did Jesus rise from the dead? In addition to what I've already said elsewhere about miracles in general, there are 4 or 5 other reasons, perhaps among others, why we ought to believe in the resurrection of Jesus as a matter of historical fact. And these are summarized by Lee Strobel as the 5 E's. So that's 1, execution; 2, empty tomb; 3, eyewitnesses; 4, early records; and 5, the emergence of the church. Number 1, execution. It is beyond dispute by the normal canons of historical research that there was a human person named Jesus who was crucified to death on a cross, then buried, then the tomb was found empty. So the first point is that Jesus was executed. There is multiple attestation to this, 4 Gospels, but also in the secular historian Tacitus. Multiple attestation to the execution of Jesus. All right, number 2, the empty tomb. The tomb which Jesus was buried in was later found empty. This proposition is also well grounded. For example, the segment of the first century Jewish population which was hostile to Christianity openly admitted that the body was missing from the tomb. They claimed that the followers of Jesus stole it. Also, the Roman authorities, hostile to Christianity, did not appeal to the corpse of Jesus to stamp out the movement, and they were against the movement of Christianity. If even your enemies agree with you on a point, that point is all the more stronger, is all the more strong. And the early Christians certainly believed in the empty tomb, so everybody in the first century, close to the New Testament events, agreed that the tomb was empty. So the second point, the empty tomb. The third point, eyewitnesses. The authors of the 4 Gospels were eyewitnesses of the resurrection, or official representatives of eyewitnesses of the resurrection. Incidentally, part of the reason why certain Gospels weren't included in the Bible was that they were not written by eyewitnesses of Jesus and his resurrection, and this is true despite the claim of lost Christianity proponents. What they'll try to tell you is that there was some conspiracy, some power grab, and so on. But that's not the case. The case was they had to have been written by eyewitnesses, or the official delegates of the eyewitnesses. Moreover, Paul had to defend himself before certain Roman officials. He appealed to the recent events of Jesus' life and the alleged resurrection of Jesus, the belief that Jesus had risen from the dead amongst Christians, as common knowledge. For example, when talking to Festus, he tells him that all the stuff did not happen in a corner. Quote, this did not happen in a corner, unquote. So Festus knew what he was saying was true. To this Festus replied, quote, almost persuaded me thou hast to become a Christian, unquote. Finally, there is the creed, or a creed, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which describes over 500 persons seeing the risen Christ alive all at once. Even non-Christian scholars date that creed to about 30 AD, which is the very time Christ died. So, in other words, this idea of waiting, years and years and years before writing anything down, or having any eyewitness a record of eyewitness testimony is a false one. Number 4, early records. In addition to the Creed, we have the Gospels. Mark was apparently written first, maybe about 50 years after the events described therein. John was apparently written about AD 90. While this does seem like a fairly long time, it is closer in time than other historical documents to the events they describe. I think crossing the Rubicon was the earliest extant record we have of that. Was written 100 years after the actual crossing of the Rubicon. And Mark was apparently, the Gospel of Mark was apparently based on what we now call Q, and Q, along with other source materials for the Gospels, were in turn based on an oral tradition dating back to Jesus himself. In the New Testament Jewish culture, oral tradition was down to a fine art, unlike today, where the game of telephone would be an apt analogy. Hearsay, rumors developing, not getting all the facts straight. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about oral tradition, not telephone. The game of telephone. Sometimes I think it's called Chinese whispers. Moreover, Jesus apparently taught in such a way that his sermons could be easily memorized. So then, we have every reason to suppose that the eyewitness accounts of Jesus with respect to his teaching and his deeds, including the resurrection itself, were accurately recorded. The Apostolic Church as a whole would be looking for factual errors anyway and would not have accepted the Gospels that we have in our Bible if they were faulty in that regard. And it is hard to forget something like somebody rising from the dead or thinking one saw that if one did not in fact see it. Number 5, the emergence of the church. It is hard to imagine a church without a resurrection first. Nobody sympathetic to the message of Jesus believed there would be a resurrection of Jesus, even after Jesus explicitly told them there would be, and even after they heard the eyewitness testimony of their fellow disciples. So even the early Christians didn't believe in the resurrection at first. Many of them later died for their belief in the resurrection. Why would Saul of Tarsus convert and endure so much to Christianity from Judaism, endure so much persecution, even martyrdom, unless he really believed in the resurrection, which he made the central claim of his ministry? If Christ be not raised, said Paul, we are of all men most miserable. And how can a tiny sect of Judaism grow to embrace the entire Roman Empire in just a few centuries? And this in spite of heavy persecution and basing the entire religion on an objective appeal to history, to people at and shortly after the alleged historical event in question. So we have people at the time of these events that this claim is based on, and we're basing the whole claim on this claim, which people could have known about, would have known about, and could have checked out for themselves. And 2,000 years later, Christianity is the largest religion in the world, all this from a tiny cult of the uneducated and lower classes of the first century in a small town. Rural Galilee. The greatest achievements of humanitarian relief and aesthetical culture, as well as the deepest thought in philosophy and science, have been inspired by this great tradition of Christianity. The whole affair is hard cheese to swallow unless there was an actual resurrection. So then, we have ample reason, historically speaking, to suppose that the resurrection did in fact happen, which means that the message of Jesus is validated, which in turn means that the Bible is an accurate record of God. So when it speaks specifically about God, more specifically than general revelation alone does, we know we can trust it. The cumulative case for accurate and specific knowledge about God in the Bible is quite solid so far, but there is even more we can say. We are not done yet. So next we're going to look at the unity of the Bible and what you might call Bible codes. So we'll get to that next.